I'm through being such a good sport, spouted all this good sportsmanship. I'm going to go back and find my business manager, an agent, producer, and three-name writer, and find out why I didn't get high noon instead of Cooper. Of course, I can't fire any of these very expensive fellas, but I can at least run my 1930 Chevrolet into one of their big black new Cadillacs.
In 1950, Patricia Neal found out she was pregnant with Gary Cooper's child. She was 24 years old. He was 49. She was one of the most promising young actresses in Hollywood. He was the biggest male star in the world, married to a prominent socialite named Veronica Balfe, known to everyone as Rocky, and they had a 13-year-old daughter named Maria who adored her father. Neal later said they were both happy when they found out. For a moment, in a hotel room, or a borrowed apartment, or wherever it was that a man who was hiding a 3-year affair conducted his private life, Patricia Neal and Gary Cooper looked at each other and believed that this pregnancy might be the thing that finally forced him to leave his wife. It was not. Cooper told her to get an abortion. In 1950, that meant an illegal procedure, performed outside any medical system, with no legal protection and no safety net. Neal went through with it, because he asked her to, because she loved him, and because an unmarried actress carrying a married man's child in 1950s Hollywood would have lost her career overnight. They both cried on the way home from the doctor. Years later, in her autobiography, Patricia Neal wrote the sentence that has followed her ever since. She said, "If I had only one thing to do over in my life, I would have that baby." That is the center of this story. Not the glamour, not the affair, not the magazine covers or the borrowed apartments or the 3 years of secret meetings while America's most beloved good guy went home every night to his wife and daughter. The center is a 24-year-old woman in a car, weeping, next to a 49-year-old man, also weeping, driving away from a decision that she would regret for the rest of her life, a decision he had made for her because he could not make the other one. He could not leave Rocky. He could not leave Maria. He could not choose. And so Patricia Neal spent 3 years loving a man who would not choose her, lost a child she wanted, suffered a nervous breakdown that drove her out of Hollywood, and rebuilt her life from the ground up on the other side of the country, without him. She went on to marry the writer Roald Dahl, lose a daughter, nearly lose a son, survive 3 massive strokes that should have killed her, win an Academy Award, and live to be 84 years old. Gary Cooper went home to his wife, got sick, converted to Catholicism on what was very nearly his deathbed, and died of cancer in 1961 at 60 years old. And decades later, in one of the strangest and most quietly redemptive endings in Hollywood history, Patricia Neal became friends with Cooper's daughter Maria, the child who had once spat on her in public for sleeping with her father. This is the story of the affair that shocked Hollywood, the good guy who was not as good as the screen made him look, and the woman who paid the price for loving him. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Gary Cooper arrived in Hollywood looking like a cowboy, because he was one. He was born Frank James Cooper on May 7, 1901, in Helena, Montana. His father, Charles Cooper, was an English-born lawyer who had emigrated to America and become a Montana Supreme Court judge. His mother, Alice, was also English. They were respectable, educated, and completely out of place in the frontier territory of early 20th century Montana, which is why, when Gary was 9, they sent him to boarding school in England, an experience he later described as miserable and isolating. He spent 3 years at Dunstable Grammar School in Bedfordshire, a homesick Montana boy in an English classroom, before his parents brought him back to America to attend school in Helena. What he learned in Montana was horses. He could ride before he could read well, and the riding was the thing that would eventually take him from a ranch in the foothills of the Rockies to the biggest sound stages in Hollywood. After high school, he went briefly to Grinnell College in Iowa, studied art, dropped out, tried commercial illustration, failed at it, and in 1924, at 23, drove to Los Angeles with almost no money and a vague idea that the movie business might need men who could ride. It did. He started as an extra, riding horses in westerns for $5 and $10 a day, falling off them on command, doing the kind of dangerous physical work that studios gave to young men who were expendable. He was not expendable for long. He was 6'3", lean, quiet, and extraordinarily handsome, in a way that was different from the polished leading men of the silent era. He looked real. He looked like he had actually been outdoors. And in 1926, a casting director noticed him and gave him a small speaking part, and within 2 years he was a leading man. His first major affair was with Clara Bow, the It Girl, the biggest female star in Hollywood, who cast him in a 1927 picture and took him to bed almost immediately. He was 26, she was 22. The affair was the talk of Hollywood, and it established a pattern that would run through the rest of Cooper's life. On every picture, with every leading lady, the on-screen romance continued off-screen. Lupe Velez, Marlene Dietrich, Tallulah Bankhead, Carole Lombard. The list of women Gary Cooper was involved with during the late 1920s and early 1930s reads like a casting directory of every major female star in Hollywood. He was, his friend Richard Widmark once said, catnip to the ladies. And the ladies were available because Cooper was the kind of man who never seemed to be trying, who radiated a quiet masculinity that women experienced as both safe and magnetic, a combination that almost no other leading man of his era managed. He did not pursue women aggressively. He simply existed in their proximity, and things happened. In 1933, at 32, he married Veronica Balfe, a New York socialite everyone called Rocky. She was the niece of Cedric Gibbons, MGM's legendary art director, and she moved in the upper circles of Hollywood society with the ease of a woman born to money and connections. The marriage was, on paper, a perfect match. The biggest male star in the world and a beautiful, well-connected, devout Catholic socialite. For a while, it worked. Their daughter Maria was born in 1937. Cooper made Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, Sergeant York, for which he won his first Academy Award, and the pride of the Yankees. He was, by the early 1940s, one of the most beloved actors in America, playing decent, honest, uncomplicated American men with a naturalness that made audiences believe that Gary Cooper actually was the good guy he played on screen. He was not. The affairs continued throughout the marriage. Ingrid Bergman during For Whom the Bell Tolls in 1943. Others whose names never made the papers. Rocky knew, or suspected, or chose not to look too closely, because she was a Catholic and divorce was not something she would consider, and because the marriage, for all its private fractures, presented a flawless public face. Gary Cooper, the good American. Rocky Cooper, the elegant wife. Maria, the adored daughter. The family the fan magazines held up as proof that Hollywood could produce something wholesome. By 1948, Gary Cooper was 47 years old, married for 15 years, serially unfaithful, and about to meet the one woman who was different from all the others. Not because she was more beautiful, not because she was more famous, because she was the one he actually fell in love with. And she was 21. Patricia Neal was not a Hollywood girl. She was a theater actress, and a serious one. She was born Patsy Louise Neal on January 20th, 1926, in Packard, Kentucky, and grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee. Her father was a coal mine manager. Her childhood was ordinary in the Southern American sense. Church on Sundays, school plays, a girl who knew from very young that she wanted to act and pursued it with the single-mindedness of someone who had no backup plan. She went to Northwestern University to study drama, dropped out after 2 years because New York was calling louder than a diploma, and arrived on Broadway at 20 years old. Within a year, she had a role in Lillian Hellman's Another Part of the Forest. Within 2, she had won the first Tony Award ever given for Best Actress in a Play, for the same production. She was 21 years old, and she had a Tony. She was not a starlet. She was a trained, serious, award-winning actress who had earned her place in the most demanding theatre city in the world. Warner Brothers signed her in 1948 and brought her to Hollywood, where the studio did what studios always did with serious young actresses. They put her in pictures opposite established leading men and waited to see what happened. The first major pairing was with Gary Cooper in The Fountainhead, an adaptation of Ayn Rand's novel, directed by King Vidor. Cooper was 47, Neal was 21. The age gap was 26 years. By Neal's own account, and she was remarkably honest about this for the rest of her life, the affair did not begin during filming. That detail matters because it tells you something about both of them. They were playing intensely physical, sexually charged scenes together for weeks, and they kept their distance. Neal said later that they had deliberately avoided sleeping together during production because they believed the sexual tension between them was what was making their on-screen chemistry so potent, and that consummating it would have diluted the work. They were kept apart, in other words, for their art. The night of the wrap party, in October of 1948, they stopped being kept apart. What followed was not a fling. That is the thing that made the Patricia Neal affair different from every other Cooper affair, and the thing that made it dangerous. Clara Bow had been a fling. Dietrich had been a fling. Ingrid Bergman had been a fling. Those were on-set romances that burned hot during production and cooled when filming ended. The kind of affairs that Rocky had learned to absorb because they always ended and Cooper always came home. Patricia Neal did not end. Patricia Neal turned into love. Both of them, in the accounts they gave separately over the decades that followed, described what happened between them with the specific, careful language of people who had been genuinely taken by surprise. He had not expected to fall in love with her. She had not expected to fall in love with a married man 26 years older than her. It happened anyway, and once it happened, neither of them could find the way out. For the next 3 years, they conducted the affair in the standard Hollywood manner, which is to say, secretly, badly, and with the full knowledge of approximately everyone in the industry. They met at borrowed apartments. They met at the homes of friends who looked the other way. They avoided being photographed together. Cooper's publicist, Harvey Orkin, who was also his close friend, was unaware of the affair early on and inadvertently made things worse by inviting both the Coopers and Neal on a trip to Aspen together. That Aspen trip was the moment it all came apart. Cooper, Orkin, Neal, and Rocky all traveled to Colorado together for a conference given by the theologian Albert Schweitzer. The Coopers were building a house there. The group toured the construction site. Cooper was visibly nervous, stiff, unable to look at either woman comfortably. Rocky, who was not a stupid woman, watched her husband's behavior that day and understood, in the way that wives understand, that something was deeply wrong. That night she confronted him, and Cooper, in one of the only moments of emotional directness in the entire story, confessed. He told Rocky that he was having an affair with Patricia Neal, and then he said the thing that made it worse than every affair that had come before. He told her he was in love. Rocky's reaction was immediate and absolute. She sent a telegram demanding he end the affair. Cooper received it. He did not end the affair. And for the next 2 years, the three of them existed in an impossible triangle. A wife who would not grant a divorce because she was Catholic, a lover who could not walk away because she was in love, and a man in the middle who could not choose because choosing was the one thing Gary Cooper, the decisive hero of 100 films, could not do in his own life. The pregnancy arrived into that deadlock like a grenade with the pin already pulled. By 1950, Patricia Neal was pregnant, and for a brief moment both of them believed it might change everything. She was 24, Cooper was 49. They had been conducting the affair for nearly 2 years, in borrowed apartments and at the homes of friends, in the particular secrecy of two people who were famous enough that being seen together in the wrong place at the wrong time would make the morning papers, and now there was a pregnancy, and Neal said later that they were both, initially, happy about it. She believed, in the way that a 24-year-old woman in love with a man who keeps telling her he loves her believes, that this would be the thing that finally forced him to act, that he would leave Rocky, that he would choose her. He did not choose her. What he chose instead was the option that 1950s Hollywood offered to men in his position, which was to make the problem disappear. He told her to have an abortion. In 1950, in the United States, abortion was illegal. It was not a clinic visit with a follow-up appointment. It was a back-alley procedure performed by someone operating outside the law, with no medical oversight, no legal protection, and real physical danger to the woman on the table. Neal went through with it. She went through with it because Cooper asked her to, because she was in love with him, because she was 24 and he was 49, and the power in that relationship had never been equal, and because an unmarried actress carrying the child of a married leading man in 1950s America would have been finished professionally overnight. The studio system would not have protected her. The public would not have forgiven her. The pregnancy, if it became known, would have ended her career, and Cooper knew that, and he used it. They both cried on the way home from the procedure. That detail, which Neal repeated for the rest of her life, is the one that tells you everything about what this relationship actually was. A man and a woman who loved each other, weeping together in a car, having just destroyed the evidence of that love, because the man could not bear the consequences of letting it exist. Neal wrote, decades later, the sentence that became the most quoted line of her autobiography: "If I had only one thing to do over in my life, I would have that baby." She called it the greatest regret of her life. She carried it for the next 54 years, until the day she died. And Cooper, having asked her to give up the one thing she most wanted, still did not leave his wife. Instead, the situation got worse, because the affair continued, and the triangle tightened, and the people around it began to crack under the pressure. Rocky Cooper, the Catholic socialite who would not divorce her husband but could not stop him from loving another woman, sent another telegram demanding he end it. Cooper received it. He did not end it. He developed ulcers so severe that he was hospitalized. His body was telling him what his mouth could not, which was that the situation was unsustainable. And then his daughter Maria found out. Maria Cooper was 13 years old, and she loved her father with the uncomplicated devotion of a child who had been adored and protected her whole life. When she learned, through whatever channel a 13-year-old in 1950s Hollywood learned such things, that her father was having an affair with Patricia Neal, her reaction was visceral and public. The story that has circulated for decades, confirmed in multiple accounts, is that Maria Cooper encountered Patricia Neal at a public event and spat on her. Whether it was literally on her or at the ground near her feet varies depending on the telling, but the gesture was unmistakable. A 13-year-old girl, expressing with her body the rage and betrayal she had no other language for, aimed at the woman she believed was destroying her family. Neal absorbed it. She did not retaliate. She did not make a public scene. She took the spit from a child and kept loving the child's father, because she was 24 and in love, and she still believed, against all evidence, that he would eventually choose her. By early 1951, Cooper and Rocky formally separated. It looked, for a moment, like the choosing had finally happened, but it had not. Cooper moved out of the family home, but he did not file for divorce. He did not propose to Neal. He did not make any definitive move toward the life she had been waiting for. He simply occupied the middle ground, separated from his wife but not free, with Neal but not committed, drifting in the paralysis of a man who could play a decisive hero on screen and could not be one in his own house. And then, while he was still in this paralysis, he started an affair with his co-star in High Noon. Her name was Grace Kelly. She was 22 years old. She was, by every standard of the era, one of the most beautiful women alive. For Patricia Neal, that was the end. The Grace Kelly affair was the thing that broke Patricia Neal, because it told her the truth she had been refusing to hear for 3 years. The truth was not that Gary Cooper was unfaithful. She had known that from the beginning. She had entered the affair knowing he was married, knowing his history, knowing the list of leading ladies that stretched back to Clara Bow. The truth Grace Kelly delivered, without intending to and without knowing she was delivering it, was simpler and more devastating than infidelity. It was that Patricia Neal was not special. She was not the exception. She was not the woman Cooper was going to leave his wife for. She was another name on a list, and there would always be another name after hers, and the man she had given up a child for was never going to choose her, because choosing was not something he did. Kelly was 22, luminously beautiful, and cast opposite Cooper in High Noon, the 1952 Western that would become his most iconic role. The affair began on set, as Cooper's affairs always did, with the quiet gravitational pull of a man who did not pursue, but simply allowed himself to be available. Neal heard about it. Everyone heard about it. Hollywood is a small town, and Grace Kelly on the arm of Gary Cooper was not something that could be hidden. Neal called Cooper while he was recovering from a hernia operation in 1951. She told him it was over. She said she could not do it anymore. She could not compete with his wife, with his daughter, with Grace Kelly, with the next woman, and the one after that. 3 years of loving a man who would not choose her, a pregnancy she had terminated at his request, and now a 22-year-old blonde in the role of the woman he went home to on screen while she waited, off-screen, for a phone call that never quite said the thing she needed it to say. She left Hollywood. That sentence covers a collapse that took months and felt, by her own description, like dying. Patricia Neal suffered a severe nervous breakdown in 1953. The accumulated weight of the affair, the abortion, the public humiliation, the Grace Kelly revelation, the years of secrecy and hope and disappointment landed on her all at once, and she came apart. She could not work. She could not function. She left Los Angeles, left the film industry, left the entire world she had built since arriving at Warner Brothers at 22, and went back to New York, where she had started, where the theater was, where nobody looked at her and saw Gary Cooper's former mistress. She was 27 years old, she had a Tony Award, she had appeared in major Hollywood films, and she was, professionally and personally, in ruins, driven out of the industry by a heartbreak that had consumed the best years of her 20s. The playwright Lillian Hellman, who was Neal's friend and had watched the Cooper affair with the clear-eyed disapproval of a woman who understood exactly how these things ended for the woman, took Neal under her wing in New York. Hellman introduced her to people. Hellman got her working again, slowly, in theatre, and Hellman introduced her to a British writer named Roald Dahl. Dahl was tall, sardonic, difficult, brilliant, and nothing like Gary Cooper. He was a former RAF fighter pilot who had been badly injured in a crash during the war, and he was building a literary career that would eventually make him one of the most famous writers of children's books in the world. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, James and the Giant Peach, Matilda. In 1953, when Neal met him, he was not yet famous. He was a short story writer with a sharp tongue and an appetite for control that would, decades later, become its own kind of problem. They married on July 2, 1953. Neal was 27, Dahl was 36. It was fast, in the way that rebounds after consuming love affairs are often fast. She needed stability. He needed a wife. They moved to England and began having children. What followed, in the years after the Cooper affair, was a sequence of tragedies so relentless that it almost defies belief, and that would test Patricia Neal far beyond anything Gary Cooper had ever put her through. But Cooper himself was not finished either. He had gone home to Rocky. He had not changed, and the years he had left were fewer than anyone around him suspected. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Gary Cooper went home to Rocky, and for a while the good guy image held together, but the man inside it was falling apart. The separation had lasted roughly a year. By 1953, Cooper and Rocky were reconciled, living together again in their Brentwood home, presenting the united family front the fan magazines required. Maria, now a teenager, had her father back. Rocky, the Catholic wife who had endured the worst public humiliation of her marriage and refused to divorce him through it, had won. Or at least, she had gotten the outcome she wanted, which was her husband back in the house, the affair over, the family intact. What she had not gotten was a changed man. Cooper was still Cooper. The quiet, passive, emotionally unavailable husband who had drifted through affairs for 20 years was not suddenly transformed by the guilt of the Patricia Neal episode. The Ingrid Bergman affair had not changed him. The Neal affair had not changed him. He was, by temperament and by the habits of a lifetime, a man who expressed love by showing up and expressed restlessness by sleeping with his co-stars, and neither his wife nor his lovers had ever been able to alter that fundamental wiring. What was changing was his body. By the mid-1950s, Cooper was in his 50s and visibly aging in a way that the camera could no longer entirely hide. The ulcers that had hospitalized him during the Neal affair were chronic now. He drank, he smoked. He had lived hard physically for decades, doing his own stunts, riding horses, pushing through grueling location shoots in deserts and mountains. The tall, lean cowboy frame that had made him a star was wearing down. His career, meanwhile, was doing something unexpected. Instead of fading gracefully into retirement, Cooper delivered one of the strongest stretches of work in his entire filmography. High Noon, in 1952, the film he had been making while the Neal affair collapsed, earned him his second Academy Award for Best Actor. He was 51 years old, playing a sheriff who stands alone against impossible odds while the people around him refuse to help, and critics have noted, for decades since, that the weariness on his face in that film was not entirely acting. The man playing a hero abandoned by his community was a man who had just abandoned a woman carrying his child. Through the mid and late 1950s, he continued working steadily, making westerns and dramas, still a bankable star, though no longer the dominant force he had been in the 1940s. Rocky stood beside him at premieres. Maria grew into a young woman. The family photograph was restored. And then, quietly, something else began to happen inside Gary Cooper that nobody expected. He began moving toward religion. Rocky had always been a devout Catholic. Cooper had been baptized Episcopalian as a child in Montana and had lived his adult life with no particular religious conviction. But in the late 1950s, influenced by Rocky and by a priest named Father Harold Ford, who became a close friend, Cooper began attending Catholic instruction. On April 9, 1959, Gary Cooper was formally received into the Roman Catholic Church. The conversion was, by the accounts of the people closest to him, genuine. It was not a deathbed gesture or a public relations move. Cooper told friends that he had spent years reflecting on his past, on the women he had hurt, on the choices he had made, and that the church had given him a framework for understanding what he had done wrong and a way to seek forgiveness for it. Whether Patricia Neal's name came up specifically in those conversations has never been documented. It did not need to. The abortion alone would have weighed on a newly Catholic conscience like a stone. In the spring of 1960, Cooper was diagnosed with prostate cancer. Surgery followed. He appeared to recover. Then, in early 1961, the cancer returned, this time in his colon and his bones. It was terminal. He was 59 years old. The news was kept quiet at first, but by early 1961 the industry knew. Jimmy Stewart, Cooper's close friend, accepted an honorary Academy Award on Cooper's behalf at the ceremony in April, and broke down in tears on stage because he knew, and the audience knew, that Cooper was dying. Gary Cooper died on May 13, 1961, at his home in Holmby Hills, Los Angeles. He was 60 years old. Rocky was with him. Maria was with him. He had been a Catholic for 2 years. He had been back with his wife for 8. He had not spoken to Patricia Neal in a decade. At his funeral, the pallbearers included Jimmy Stewart, Jack Benny, and Jerry Wald. The whole industry mourned him as Hollywood's ultimate good guy, the quiet American, the man who embodied decency on screen for 35 years. Patricia Neal, 3,000 miles away in England, raising children with Roald Dahl, heard the news and grieved privately. She had loved him, she would never fully stop. And the worst years of her life, the ones that would have broken a lesser person entirely, were not behind her, they were just beginning. The tragedies that hit Patricia Neal after Gary Cooper would have destroyed most people. They came one after another, in a sequence so relentless it reads less like a life and more like a test of how much a single person can absorb. She and Roald Dahl had settled in England and begun having children. Their first daughter, Olivia, was born in 1955. Their son, Theo, followed in 1960. A second daughter, Tessa, came in 1957, and two more children, Ophelia and Lucy, would follow later. For a while, the family in the English countryside looked like the fresh start Neal had needed after the Cooper years. She was working again, selectively, choosing film roles that interested her, rather than taking everything the studios offered. She was, slowly, rebuilding a career and an identity that had nothing to do with being the woman Gary Cooper had loved and left. Then, in December of 1960, 4-month-old Theo was in his baby carriage on a New York street when a taxi struck the carriage. The impact was catastrophic. Theo suffered severe brain damage that required multiple surgeries and years of rehabilitation. He survived, but the injuries were permanent and devastating, and Neal and Dahl spent years managing his care, inventing new therapeutic techniques, and fighting for his recovery, with a ferocity that doctors said made a measurable difference in his outcome. A shunt valve developed partly through Dahl's advocacy for Theo's treatment became known as the Wade-Dahl-Till valve and was used on thousands of other children with similar injuries. Then, in November of 1962, their eldest daughter Olivia, 7 years old, contracted measles. It progressed to measles encephalitis, a swelling of the brain. She died on November 17, 1962. She was 7. Patricia Neal buried her daughter, continued caring for her brain-damaged son, and kept going. She did not stop. She went back to work. In 1963, she starred opposite Paul Newman in HUD, playing a tough, weathered housekeeper on a Texas ranch, and gave one of the finest performances of the decade. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress. She was 37 years old, grieving a daughter, caring for a disabled son, and standing on a stage holding an Oscar. Then, in February of 1965, while pregnant with her 5th child, Patricia Neal suffered 3 massive strokes in rapid succession. She was 39 years old. The strokes were so severe that she was in a coma for 3 weeks. When she came out of it, she could not walk. She could not speak coherently. She could barely recognize her own children. Doctors told Dahl privately that she might never recover meaningful function. Roald Dahl refused to accept that. Whatever else can be said about him, and there is plenty to say, because the marriage would eventually reveal a controlling and unfaithful husband who bore uncomfortable similarities to certain men in Neal's past, Dahl's response to her strokes was extraordinary. He devised a rehabilitation program so aggressive and so unconventional that medical professionals initially resisted it. He recruited volunteers from the local community to work with Neal for hours every day, drilling her on speech, on movement, on basic cognitive function. He was relentless. He was demanding. He was, by Neal's own later account, sometimes cruel in his insistence that she push harder, and it worked. Patricia Neal relearned how to walk. She relearned how to talk. She relearned how to act. By 1968, 3 years after the strokes that should have ended her life, she was back on a film set, starring in The Subject Was Roses, and earning a 2nd Academy Award nomination. A woman who had survived an illegal abortion, a nervous breakdown, the death of a daughter, the brain damage of a son, and 3 strokes that left her unable to speak, was standing in front of a camera again, performing at a level that earned her an Oscar nomination. The resilience is almost beyond comprehension. The girl from Knoxville, Tennessee, who had arrived on Broadway at 20, who had won a Tony before she could legally drink, who had fallen in love with the wrong man and paid for it with a decade of suffering, simply would not stop getting back up. The marriage to Dahl did not survive the strokes, though it took another 15 years to formally end. Dahl, who had been her rescuer through the recovery, became increasingly difficult, controlling, and unfaithful. Neal discovered he was having an affair with one of her closest friends, Felicity Crossland. They divorced in 1983, after 30 years of marriage. Dahl married Crossland almost immediately. Neal described the divorce with the particular dryness of a woman who had been through enough by 60 to be surprised by almost nothing. She had loved the wrong men. Both of them, Cooper and Dahl, had been brilliant, charismatic, unfaithful, and ultimately unable to give her what she needed. She had survived both of them, and she had survived them not because she was lucky, but because she was, in the plainest possible sense, tougher than anything that happened to her. She moved back to the United States. She lived in New York, then in Connecticut, then in Nashville, near where she had grown up. She acted occasionally. She gave speeches about stroke recovery. She became an advocate for brain injury rehabilitation, turning the worst thing that had ever happened to her body into something useful for other people. And somewhere in those later years, a letter arrived, or a phone call was made, or an introduction was arranged, and Patricia Neal found herself, for the first time in decades, in conversation with Maria Cooper, the girl who had spat on her. Maria Cooper Janis had spent decades carrying what her father's affair had done to her family. She had been 13 when she found out. She had been the girl who spat on Patricia Neal in public, a child expressing in the only language available to her the rage of watching a stranger threaten to take her father away. She had grown up in the shadow of the scandal, watching her mother suffer through it, watching her father leave and come back, carrying the particular burden of a child who loves a parent whose behavior she cannot defend. She had become, in adulthood, a painter and an art historian, and she had married a concert pianist named Byron Janis. She had lived a full, private life of her own, far from the tabloids and the sound stages, and she had, for most of that life, not spoken to Patricia Neal, and not wanted to. What changed, according to the accounts both women gave in their later years, was time. Not forgiveness exactly, or at least not forgiveness in the simple, greeting card sense. Something more complicated, an understanding, arrived at slowly over decades, that the people involved in the Cooper affair had all been, in their different ways, damaged by the same man's inability to make a choice, and that holding on to the anger was no longer serving anyone who was still alive. The contact between them began tentatively. A mutual friend, a letter, a phone call. Neal, by then in her 60s, was living quietly in the United States, long past the strokes and the Dahl divorce. No longer the young woman who had fallen in love with a married movie star, but an old woman who had survived more than most people survive in 3 lifetimes. Maria, by then in her 50s, was no longer the furious 13-year-old, but a middle-aged woman who had lived long enough to understand that her father's choices were not Patricia Neal's fault alone. They met, they talked, and over the years that followed, they developed something that neither of them had expected, which was a genuine friendship, not a close, intimate, daily friendship. A quiet, respectful, intermittent one, the kind that exists between two people who share a history too painful to discuss constantly, but too important to pretend never happened. Maria said, in a later interview, that she had come to see Neal as a remarkable woman who had been through extraordinary things. Neal said, of Maria, that she understood why the girl had done what she did, and that she held no grudge, because how could you hold a grudge against a child defending her father? The reconciliation is the part of the story that redeems it, not because it erases what happened, but because it proves that the damage did not have the final word. 2 women, separated by a generation and connected by a man who had hurt both of them, found a way to sit in the same room and see each other as people, rather than as positions in a scandal. Rocky Cooper, Gary's wife, had died in 2000, at the age of 87. She had never remarried. She had remained Mrs. Gary Cooper for the rest of her life, the Catholic wife who had refused to divorce her husband and who had, in the end, gotten him back. Whether that constituted winning depends entirely on what you think she won. She got a repentant Catholic husband for his final 8 years, a man who was faithful at last because he was dying and because the church had given him a reason to stop. She did not get the years of loyalty she had deserved from the beginning. She got the residue. Patricia Neal lived until August 8, 2010. She died at her home in Edgartown, Massachusetts, at the age of 84. Lung cancer. She had survived the Cooper affair, the abortion she called the greatest regret of her life, a nervous breakdown, the death of a daughter, the brain damage of a son, 3 massive strokes, a 30-year marriage to a brilliant and difficult man who left her for her friend, and a second career rebuilt from the ruins of the first one. She had won a Tony Award at 21 and an Academy Award at 37, and had been nominated for a second Oscar after relearning how to speak. She had done more, endured more, and come back from more than almost any performer in the history of American entertainment. When she died, the obituaries called her one of the great actresses of the 20th century, and they also, inevitably, mentioned Gary Cooper. She would not have minded. She never hid from it. She never pretended the affair hadn't happened, never disowned it, never claimed she had been purely a victim. She said, plainly and repeatedly, for the rest of her life, that she had loved Gary Cooper, that the love had been real, that the cost had been enormous, and that if she had one thing to do over, she would have had the baby. Look at the whole shape of it. A man from Montana who could ride a horse before he could read, who arrived in Hollywood and became the face of American decency, who played good men so convincingly that the whole country believed he was one, who married a woman he cheated on for 20 years, who fell in love with a woman 26 years younger than him, got her pregnant, told her to end it, wept in the car beside her, went back to his wife, started an affair with Grace Kelly, and died a Catholic at 60, forgiven by God if not by everyone else. And the woman he left behind, a girl from Knoxville with a Tony Award and a broken heart, who lost the baby, lost the man, lost her mind for a while, rebuilt it all, married another difficult man, buried a daughter, saved a son, survived 3 strokes, won an Oscar, lost the second husband too, and came out the other side of all of it still standing, still working, still refusing, with a stubbornness that bordered on the supernatural, to be defined by the worst things that had happened to her. Gary Cooper was Hollywood's good guy. Patricia Neal was the proof that the good guy was a performance. She was the woman who loved him, who paid the price for it, and who outlived both the love and the price by half a century. And at the end, she was friends with his daughter, the girl who spat on her. The two of them, sitting in a room together, 2 old women who had both been hurt by the same quiet man from Montana, finally able to see past what he had done to them and into what they had each, separately, survived. That is the redemption the story offers. Not from Cooper. He never offered one. From the women he left behind, who found, in each other, something he had never been able to give either of them: peace. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.